Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're really excited to have you here and to also have David here to speak about buying better. On behalf of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, we'd like to welcome you. If you're new to ONN, ONN is a network representing the 58,000 nonprofits who work within Ontario. We focus on public policy, advocacy work, and services that help strengthen our sector. If you're already a member to ONN, welcome back. We're so happy to have you here, and we hope that you're able to gain benefit from this webinar and also from the other membership benefits, such as our discount to nonprofit driven or other webinars that we'll be launching this fall. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please feel free to message us in the chat box. We recommend that you open and close and reopen your browser. But if you do still have problems, feel free to contact our team. Our number is 416-642-5786. So we wanted to just start with a poll to see, where everyone is coming from today. So if you can fill it out, we have the options of Northern Ontario, Eastern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, Central Ontario, or other. Maybe you're coming from outside of the province. And so we'll just leave that for a moment. Great. So it seems like we have a pretty nice mix between different places in Ontario that everyone's visiting us from. So thank you for filling that out. We have a mix between Central, Southwestern, and Eastern. And for those of you who are in this webinar who may be outside of Ontario, welcome as well. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. ONN recognizes that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This land has been stewarded by many Indigenous peoples for time immemorial, including the Wendat and Haudenosaunee. Toronto is also part of the Métis homeland and home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And so one last question before we get started today is, I would love to know, what are you hoping to gain from this webinar? Are you hoping to gain tools and techniques to help you run your own supplier sourcing process? Maybe are you looking for procurement implementation options that can help you reduce cost and risk? Are you hoping to gain access to procurement expertise? Are you looking for opportunities to save money through nonprofit collaboration and leveraging the buying power of our sector? Or are you joining us for this webinar to look for purchasing resources and takeaways? Great. So this is a big range. It seems like the most popular reason that people are joining this webinar is because they want to find ways to save money through nonprofit collaboration, which is awesome and great to hear. Our hope is that in the next 60 minutes, we will cover all of these topics. So we'll be going over the what, why, how of well-managed procurement, and also going into a little bit of what social procurement means and how does that differ from well-managed procurement. And so now I would like to introduce our speaker, David. And so David is the principal at Round Table Procurement Services, RTPS, which is an organization focused on helping charities and nonprofits improve the procurement processes. They've been working since 2003 with the nonprofit sector across Canada to better manage purchasing activities. This has included the development of collaborative purchasing programs that help organizations work together to save money, reduce risk, develop standards, and more effectively manage the goods and services needed to serve their communities. So thank you so much, David, for joining us today.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful, and I will pass it off to you to lead our presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks again, Melanie. Thank you to everybody for joining today to talk about procurement. It sounds happy to hear that there's lots of interest, and that's great. I guess a couple of qualifiers before I get started. It's wonderful to hear that people are interested in collaboration and working together. We will touch on that today, there's certainly much more detail we can get into on that topic, perhaps on future webinars or publications. So that's good to know that that is a point of interest. The other qualifier I'll mention is with something as broad as the topic of procurement, there'll probably be some material here that is perhaps more detailed than you're looking for, and some that is more high level depending on your own background. So bear with me if you could. We're trying to put together a level of information that is applicable for the wide audience here. And if you've ever seen or heard one of these webinars with us before, you may recognize some of the messages. As I say, you know, we can't assume everybody has been through our previous, I think, 5 or 6 webinars in the past. So we want to make sure that we're getting everyone back up on the same page. So with that, I'll get started with a little bit of background. This has been a wonderful, long, and very healthy relationship between the ONN and RTPS. We started working together several years ago when it became clear that the sector was becoming increasingly interested in challenges related to purchasing and procurement. So we actually conducted a study together to identify what some of those key issues were, and I bring that up because you'll see me reference to some of the findings of that study throughout this presentation. It also led to the development of the ONN purchasing program, or the ONN PP, which many of you I believe are either aware of or have registered for it already. I'll speak a little bit more about that at the end, and that is directly related to this notion of collaborating and working together to improve our purchasing performance. So that's something that is a very tangible solution that we'll speak to at the end that you can investigate more after this presentation is over. But in addition, in addition to supplier programs and better group deals, the ONN PP is also committed to information sharing and education. So this webinar, as with the previous webinar, is part of that commitment to try to raise the purchasing IQ, we often say, of the sector, to make sure that everyone is spending their well-earned money as efficiently as possible. So this is part of that sharing and education component of the ONN PP. So as I say, I wanted to make sure we started at some base level, and really the definition of procurement and purchasing, or supply chain management, or you pick the title, can mean different things to different people. It could be as simple as shopping, but to get everyone on the same page what we're referring to when we talk about managed procurement, I wanted to go over that first. Certainly the most visible and top of mind topic is or element of procurement is the idea of supplier selection, and that's certainly core to it. Surrounding selecting suppliers, some prep work that we often require or recommend around understanding your needs before you go looking for a supplier, and then after you find a supplier, making sure that the deal you find is properly implemented within your team and monitored to make sure it's performing well. So that's certainly all a core part of good procurement. What I wanted to just share with you, and again, this is going to be a lot of detail. I'm relying on this being a leave behind for some of you to refer to later, but I will speak more to staff support. Procurement, like many other administration functions, HR, finance, IT, it really is a staff support role as much as anything. So being there to support staff to make sure they're getting the goods and service they need is a key part of procurement, as is that relationship management with suppliers. Suppliers are an extension of your organization. They should be treated as such, and so that managing them in a really professional and well thought out way is a key part of procurement as well. And then finally, what we call infrastructure, or building a good foundation. You can think of things like having good contracts, having policies, principles, like that guide all the activities related to how you spend your money. So if you think about a broad view of procurement, which we do, these are the kind of things that we're referring to. Again, this is a lot of content. I'm not going to go through each of these points, but hopefully it provides a little bit of a reference point for you after this session today. We can boil it down to, to simplify, we could talk about really what are the key objectives of having good procurement. If you have a procurement department, these are certainly, you can build on these objectives, even if you're trying to manage procurement with your existing staff, which of course is very, very common in the sector. Then I encourage you to consider these objectives. Right at the top, of course, is hard dollar savings, and that was clear in what was provided in the poll at the beginning. People are looking for savings, no doubt, and that is, it's going to tend to be at the top of the list. However, you want to make sure you're doing that within the bounds of good governance, and that includes good supplier selection practices, management practices, transparency, fair play, and we'll speak to that a little bit more. You want to do that without, it's easy to do some of this stuff and add more controls while creating a lot of red tape. That's counterintuitive. You want to drive efficiencies. This spend management needs to be done in a way that makes it easier to get what you need, not more difficult. So that's always got to be in mind for the procurement team. Again, I mentioned the supporting staff. I'm going to continue to mention that element because it is something that you have to, we always have to remember that we are in a service role. The ultimate goal of your organization is not to buy things, it's to meet your mission, and we're here to support that. I mentioned the healthy relationships with suppliers. Again, this is part of an element of building credibility for your organization and the sector overall. Treating suppliers well and managing those relationships, we would argue, is as important as doing the same with your own internal staff. So that's a big part of well-managed procurement. And then, as I mentioned, just simply always keeping the overall mission in mind. So we don't want to get too carried away with what we think are best practices for one organization that may differ for another. And that can speak to things like social procurement, which we'll get to a little bit later, but making sure that the way you spend your money aligns with the way you want to manage and operate your organization towards your overall mission. In the end, it's about managing total cost while supporting what the organization's all about. And that's, if you keep that bottom line in mind, I think you'll be okay. And we'll talk about the topic of total cost a little bit more. The final thing I'll mention, and this is out of acknowledgement for others on the call or who might be working on procurement that are in other areas of support roles like finance. Very typical for finance to be the owner of the procurement function. And as in finance or human resources or IT or asset management, any of the shared functions, there is this balance that we're always keeping in mind. And I've talked enough about the support, but I continue to hammer on that because you have to have an internal client mentality if you're helping the organization buy what they need to operate on the front lines. However, balancing that off sometimes can be making sure that you're staying within policy and standards and even regulations sometimes. So that notion of good governance can often go counter to trying to support. So for example, you have staff who want to single source to their favorite suppliers all the time. Well, you'd like to be able to support them in what they want, but the reality is that good governance and the changing world we're living in doesn't allow for that kind of lack of process. So finding the balance between the two is important. And then finally, bringing leadership. Like many areas of the sector, this is an area of change, being on top of things that are changing, whether it's changing regulations or changing commodity markets, even to understand how to support budgeting moving forward with changing pricing. This is an area of expertise. It's an area of leadership. Just like you've got expertise in human resources and IT, expertise in procurement can go a long way for your organization. I'll take this opportunity to mention the notion of social procurement versus what we're talking about today, and that is well-managed internal procurement. The two can certainly have some overlap, but frankly are very different. And so I wanted to try to help sort out any potential confusion, because I know the ONN is doing some great work in the area of social procurement, and I encourage you to read up and make sure you're getting educated and follow that along. and we're big supporters of the idea, but I wanted to clarify the difference. To be clear, social procurement is about influencing purchasing decisions to make sure that they include the notion of social benefit and the idea of a balanced criteria, that it's not always about price, that the social good that can come out of spending is an important concept. We totally support that. What we're talking about today is more how nonprofit organizations manage their own purchasing, which may include that element of social procurement, but goes into other areas as well. So it's really encouraging buying from social enterprises versus how you manage your own spending internally. I think if you think about the biggest benefit for the sector, one of the biggest areas of benefit can be increased purchasing from for-profit and government agencies from social enterprises. That is certainly a worthwhile cause. I think the benefits we're striving for primarily in the work we do is making sure that nonprofit organizations are managing their own internal spending as efficiently as they can. So one case we're promoting buying from social enterprises. In our case, we're advocating for better buying practices across all nonprofits. The bottom line is there is some commonality, but really it's internal purchasing that you're doing and make sure you're doing it well. That's what we're focused on, versus understanding how influencing buying practices from everyone, including outside of the sector, to encourage purchasing from social enterprises and other social procurement impact. Those are two very different concepts, and I hope I've explained it well enough. But it's really, it's your own purchasing versus encouraging better purchasing from even outside the sector. That's the key difference. I think I did a very clear job of that. So keep an eye on questions and let me know. Okay, let's get into that was the what. Let's get into the why, and then we'll deal with some of the how to give you some helpful tips moving forward. Part of that study I mentioned that we did with the and a few years ago identified what some of the top pressures were in spending, and I think we've been able to modify those slightly over the last couple of years, just working with more and more nonprofit organizations. But clearly that idea of cost management is simply economic survival in some cases, managing budgets. That dollar, the almighty dollar, is just, it's hard to come by and easy to waste. So that the notion of making sure you're managing spending is right at the top, and that was number one. Number two was what we just talked about, even in making sure that how you purchase aligns with your own internal values, and that you recognize that as spenders of, in many cases, public fund, or at least hard raised funds, to spend them properly is a key factor, and it needs to be something everybody's thinking about. Of course, you get into resource constraints, and that simply means just not enough time. And so a lot of the concepts I talk about today, I get it. You'd love to do RFPs more often, or do a better job at managing your current suppliers. There's not enough time in the day, so we get that. And that's part of why we try to create some shared services, shared programs that people can tap into. But that is currently on certainly on everyone's mind, that they just don't have enough time, not enough capacity within their own teams. This notion of government's involvement or interest, I think that really came out of the launch of the broader public sector procurement guidelines and procurement directive in 2012, and ever since then, and before then, depending on who your funding agency is or which government bodies you work with, there's different levels of requirements or interests that they have with respect to how different parts of the sector spend their money. It's just a reality now, and in many cases, we're assisting our colleagues when they're filling out funding applications, because there are questions coming up about procurement policy, how you manage internal purchasing. This is something that people care about, especially the government bodies who help fund the good work we do. The idea of risk awareness, it's just a reality of today's world. Having good contracts, for example, having proper terms and conditions, making sure your suppliers have the proper insurance. And I know there's great great announcements today from O&N about WSIB, making sure that all your suppliers are properly covered. All this stuff is, it's more important than it ever was, and it just continues to be. So the idea of risk management has really become a significant part of what we do in our procurement work. And then finally, there's this notion of just reputation. We've seen enough examples of various types of scandal or just conflict or challenges, whether it's from suppliers or the press or Money Sense magazine coming out with their top charities and how they manage their spending. This is something that just the world cares about, and how you manage your money and how you manage your spending is on a wide radar right now. So that we're trying to make sure everyone's getting their good work done without risking having a headline show up that damages reputation. So that's not to be too extreme with the last two. Those are certainly factors that we have to think about. The benefits of well-managed procurement, thankfully, align with some of those challenges and some of the objectives I mentioned off the top. By allowing people to focus on your procurement work means that you can create capacity in the other parts of your organization. So I think someone said recently, if no one's doing it, everybody's doing it. And that just means that, if you leave the procurement or purchasing activities up to the whole organization, everybody's got some hand in it, which means they're not doing what they were hired to do. So by putting some focus, if you can, on having some dedicated resource to procurement, you create capacity elsewhere. And it's like with other shared services. I don't know, it depends on your situation with IT or HR, but there's similar arguments to be made there that having experts handle that takes the burden off the rest of your staff. I talked enough about risk reduction, but it's listed here again. It's right at the top of the benefits we see, and it's amazing once you have hold of your contracts and when you have contracts, and once you're managing them properly, it takes a lot of stress off the senior leadership in your organization. This notion of integrating values, it's a real thing. We've seen as we've helped organizations develop their policies and the wording in RFPs and just even how they go to market, including in your criteria and how you select your suppliers, things like environmental policies or workplace diversity, fair work principles. If you're selecting your garments or linens and you want to make sure that the manufacturing practices of those products are aligned with your own values. These are things that you can do once you're managing procurement in a well thought out way. It's difficult to do if it's all done very ad hoc. And one example might be purchasing from the dollar store. We hear that quite a bit. You're certainly going to save a lot of money at the dollar store, but how about some of those other elements? Never mind quality, but around fair work practices that are behind some of those products. We have a question.
Yes, so we do have a question from the audience. So the question is there a one-page template or somewhere we could find terms and conditions that we can provide to our own suppliers or exhibitors? So for example, if we had exhibitors or sponsors in a hotel conference center, would there be somewhere we could find kind of standard template terms and conditions to use?
Yeah, the idea of standard templates is always a tough one. It's such a broad sector and such a broad set of needs. There's loads of material on the web. A lot of it is not what I'd recommend, so that's a tough place to go. I understand. Perhaps what I'd ask anyone who needs some help in this area, we can, with even a short conversation or even bullet points in an email, better understand what the area of focus of your work is and get you a few standard clauses that will help and you could build around but could act as a core. So if I could ask you to use the contact information at the end of this presentation to reach out to the O&N purchasing program, we can help exactly with that sort of thing.
Wonderful, and we have one quick follow-up question to that. And so in the terms and conditions, is it enough to request in writing that exhibitors and sponsors need to have general liability? insurance, or do we have to physically collect the insurance certificates? Is that maybe something that wouldn't be something you normally would consider in supplier relationships?
Yeah, we'd certainly consider it, and gosh, can we check to see if any risk managers or lawyers are on the before I answer? I mean, there's that there is a spectrum of what is sort of you can get away with as a minimum, and what you'd like to have. Yeah, in an ideal world, we'd love to collect all that information from all our suppliers all the time and have updated WSIB and certificates at a very minimum. And I'll say this. Just to help people get started with something, require that they have it and require that they will provide it to you when asked. It doesn't mean you have to ask every year or every quarter for updated documents, but that they're required to have it and required to produce it if you ask for it. So then it's up to you to when you want to follow up. But that's the minimum, and if you have the capacity to collect and manage the updated documentation, please go for it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, I'm glad there was no follow-up question, because insurance and risk management can be a real long and fruitful discussion, but we'll put it on our list to partner with some of our risk partners to produce some helpful documentation in the future. That leads directly into good governance, this idea of fair and transparent and defensible. And you'll hear me use that word again. In some cases, it's not just for your funders or your government, but just if anyone asks, even your board or auditors, how you selected certain suppliers, having a process that you can point to is very helpful, especially around audit time, we've found. And then finally, cost savings, and not to bury the lead, but certainly everybody's looking to save money. There's different approaches, and we've had some good experience. At Roundtable, we've been doing this in the sector for the last 16 years it is now. So we've been able to collect enough results to give you some ranges. If you can dedicate some resources, 15 to 20% savings is certainly not unrealistic, and that's these are general numbers across the board. Some categories have it's a lot tougher to get those kind of savings out of some, but if you try to share some resources, which we've got some models that we have shared teams across different organizations, or you've got maybe some partnerships that you can share procurement support, less focus on your own needs, but still some significant savings available. And then finally, with buying group, you go from 10% just because they've got something to, in cases where we can really leverage a lot of volume, you can see some significant cost savings. So people are always asking me, what kind of savings can we see? It depends on what you're buying, it depends on the kind of model you're implementing, but this hopefully gives you a sense. We're not talking about 2, 3, 5%, not usually talking about 50% either, although it happens in some line items, but this kind of 10 to 30%, big range, I know, but as I say, it's a sweeping statement. The impact is available, the opportunity impact is certainly available. So in the theme of why, I'm gonna go with why should you use a formal sourcing process. So specifically mentioned, we've been talking about general well-managed procurement, specifically talking about a formal sourcing process as the most common element of well-managed procurement. Why should you ever? There's lots of reasons. We've talked about the notion of cost savings. People want that. Well, going through a competitive process is the best way to put some pressure on pricing. It's not simply because there's competition involved, but it's because usually through a selection process, like an RFP, for example, and we'll talk about a few different tools in a minute, but you're forced to articulate your needs very clearly. And in doing that, it makes it easier for the suppliers to get a little more fine on what it is, how they price out or cost out your requirements. So rather than having a general discussion or getting your needs out in an email, by being forced to articulate your requirements in an RFP document, it gives more clarity to what your requirements are, and therefore some better clarity on supplier pricing. But then there's the competition piece as well. So that forces some of the cost down. It might be required by your policy if you have one, but certainly by if you're subject to the broader public sector directive, for example, there's some pretty clear requirements when an RFP is necessary. So if you're receiving over 10 million a year in provincial government funding, then you should be aware of your BPS requirements. Yeah, go ahead. A question.
So we have a question about sourcing, the sourcing process and procurement in general. Is it related only to products, or should we be using this for services as well?
Yeah, great question. And it's everything you buy. It's every, you know, you need to at least create your own internal policy and rules around when you use what kind of process, and hopefully the next couple of slides will help with that. But there's no reason to really separate goods and services in that thinking. It's all the principles apply in both cases. So you know, it's absolutely everything you buy from a third-party organization, any supplier.
Wonderful, thank you.
So just be aware of where competitive sourcing process might be required, again, depending on your own funder, policy, board, etc. It again promotes transparency and fairness and helps manage some of that risk we talked about. It ensures the best fit. So not only helping to make sure you're getting the best price by articulating your needs, you're also making sure you're getting the best product or service. So again, just the process of going through writing an RFP forces you to really define what it is you're looking for, and that means you're more likely to get a solution that meets your needs. That, you know, that's as important as getting a good price, is making sure you get something that actually will work for you. And finally, that idea of defensibility or confidence. And even if it's in your own head, I don't know, depending on, I know I feel a lot better when I have a process behind me that that led us to a decision. That can be if ever you're challenged, or like I say, we've seen a few examples lately through an audit process where auditors decide to focus on procurement as a topic, and when you can produce the results of a good selection process to identify how you picked that consultant or that you know, the architect or that print supplier, whatever it is, that makes you feel a lot better. But I'll tell you, you know, we've seen lately, when you've got confidence in how you arrived at a purchasing decision, and you've got a process to support that confidence, when the tough times come, it makes things a lot easier to work through. So just like you have issues with staff relationships and staff performance, you know, believe me, we know that suppliers will not always be perfect. And when there are mistakes made, problems that come up, it's natural to have a first thought to say maybe we're working with the wrong organization. However, if you think back and you think about through the process and the steps you went through to make the selection in the first place, if you've got some confidence there, it can help you believe that, no, this is, you know, we've got the right partner, it's just working through these particular issues. So it can take a little longer to go through a selection process, but it's certainly worth it for all these reasons. So I'll get into more of the how, and so hopefully we've given a good overview of what we're talking about when we're speaking about managed procurement, and why it's worth thinking about and spending 60 minutes with us on a webinar, hopefully at least, and then some time after this to think about some of these points. Now we'll try to give you some tools. Again, some of this may be helpful as you take it away after, but we'll go through them quickly now. So this is a good example. We're not going to go through all these points, don't worry. But this can be a bit of a roadmap for you if you decide to run a formal sourcing process. You can see, you know, we've got 5 general steps. I mentioned them on an earlier slide: developing a plan, developing your requirements, preparing for selection, getting into the selection process. Then, you know, people forget about some of the implementation, but let's face it, a good deal is no good if your staff don't know about it. So communicating the results, so, you know, of your selection, who your supplier is, how you engage with them, that's an important piece. And then monitoring that supplier to make sure that they're living up to their expectations, and your organization's living up to their expectations as well. So I'll leave this with you. You can use these points to perhaps think about your own future selection processes. And certainly, if it generates questions, please let us know through the O&M purchasing program. Now, that's a broad overview. What we can do is talk about some specific tools and try to help explain the difference, because many of these acronyms are thrown around, and if you're not familiar with them, it can create some confusion. So RFPs, our request for proposals, is the most common, I'd say, at least the most common term. It is the broadest of the three we've mentioned here, and that is in terms of what you're allowing or asking the suppliers to come back to you with. And that is really proposals that will describe the supplier's approach, maybe some new ideas. Yes, it includes pricing for sure, but in an RFP, you're allowing for some leeway and flexibility in terms of some creativity that the suppliers can come back to you with. So in cases where you're not really sure you know what you're looking for, or even if you think you know, our advice is to be a little less prescriptive, because you never know what good ideas suppliers have out there. So describe your needs, certainly. Describe what you know about the restraints within any good or service, but allow for some flexibility. So for example, if you need some signage for an event and you want to select a printing supplier for your event and then for ongoing long-term, certainly describe what you know in terms of what your needs are, but don't prescribe to them how they should stockpile your inventory, how they should print for you on what kind of lead time is required. I mean, tell them what you need and let the suppliers come back to you with their approach. And that way you can see where not only they have the best pricing, but they also have the best fit to how they would approach your needs versus how you think they should approach it. So the RFP is a little more general. You get pricing, but you get a lot more. With an RFQ, you're much more specific to what your requirements are. So you might say, I need a 5x8 poster of this. I need a banner with this color scheme. Here's all the designs. So back to the printing. So when you're very clear about the specifications and you simply need pricing, then you would use an RFQ, where really the selection criteria is going to be based almost exclusively on price. Whereas above in the RFP, you're going to have probably more of a balanced selection criteria that will include quality, approach, fit with the supplier, that sort of thing. So we get more specific to price in an RFQ. On the other end of the spectrum, when you're really not sure what you need and you're not really sure who's out there or what the capabilities of the market are, doing an RFI, request for information, is often a good idea. It's really an education tool. You're not asking for pricing at this point, because you're not giving the suppliers enough to provide pricing. This is a market scan. It often leads into an RFP or even an RFQ, but it allows you to get educated a little more on what the skills are and who the best players are in the market. Cast those widely, just see what you get, and that will tell you a lot more about the industry that you're interested in. There are others that we don't have to get into now. Tenders are more common in construction projects. There's no doubt there are times when informal quotes are just fine. A request for interest, request for qualifications. These are all things we can deal with in another session or another publication, but we just won't have time to get into all those now. And I think we find that based on what we recommend, the top three, RFP, RFQ, RFI, are either the most common or the most commonly recommended by us for the sector. Now, there are different approaches to whether you use any of those, RF whatever. That's RFX, you'll see that. That's not a typo. We do that when just to refer to any request for anything. In some cases, you should go public or make it an open process, and that just means publicly posting it somewhere. We use a common RFP platform. Merck's is a common one. You can post it on your own website. Back when people read print, it was something you'd put in the newspapers. And in some small communities, it's still a good idea if you've got a local publication, even to put it there. But it might be an industry website. But wherever it is, posting it publicly is a great idea when you want to cast a wide net. And I just wanted to note for anyone following the broader public sector guidelines or the directive for procurement practices, it is required to go to an open process when the value of whatever you're buying is over 100,000. So the other approach is to go closed or invitational. So this is fine when you really have a good idea of which suppliers could meet your needs. I be careful to not make that assumption too quickly, though. But if you do have a good sense of who you want to include in your process, and you can defend why they were in the process, if anyone asks, then you can go to an invitational process where you would send the RFP directly to those organizations. So it's closed to anyone else, and just be aware, just because we've seen it, if you don't want to be on the other end of a good supplier placing a call to your executive director, CEO, or board chair to say, hey, I really could have done a good job here. Why wasn't I included? So just be careful and just be clear that if you go closed or invitational, you have a good sense of who the properly qualified suppliers are.
So we have an interesting question. Someone's wondering, how do you navigate in issuing RFPs when you already have existing suppliers? You don't want to, disrupt or hurt that relationship. At the same time, you want to see what else is out there. Yeah,
great question, and it actually speaks back to one of those principles I mentioned earlier around supplier relationship management. It is a good one. You need to do what's best for our organization, and sometimes that will not make your suppliers as happy as they'd like to be. But we find communication is really the key. That if you communicate to your supplier ahead of time, that look, this is the right thing to do for us. It's helpful if you have policy that dictate when you go to market, because you can point to that policy and you say, look, we love you, but our policy mandates that we go to market. They'll understand. This is the world that they live in now, and there may be some disappointment there for sure, but they'll understand. And as long as they've been a good supplier, then they obviously will participate, and in fact, they'll have the inside track because they know your organization very well. They have good history, and perhaps they'll win the business again. But they generally understand if you explain it to them ahead of time. Just don't have an RFP land on their desk out of the blue. That's all I recommend, is make sure you give them the heads up.
Great, thank you.
So just to wrap up that discussion about closed or public, if you're unsure, there's no harm in at least posting an opportunity on your website or other publication or digital medium. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is you get a lot of responses. If you're worried about that, just make your requirements very clear in your document. You'll only get, if you do that, you'll only get suppliers responding who can actually fulfill your needs. You won't get wasted. You won't get people wasting their time responding if they don't think they can do it. And then finally, buying groups. It's just a final sort of a tool. You can bypass a lot of this good work and leverage the work done by others if you take advantage of some buying groups. Yes, the ONNPP is a good example. There are others out there that where this kind of rigor that we're talking about has already taken place to select the vendors for the buying group, and you can take advantage of that, provided those suppliers and the solutions meet your needs. Okay, some principles, and I'll just quickly, because I think we've touched on these. Be respectful with your suppliers. Great question to reference that, but make sure you're communicating through the whole thing. An important point, just going through a process when you already know the outcome is not a good move. Find a way around your policies if that's the only reason you're going to market for. These are a lot of work, RFPs, responding to them. And if you have no intention or you already know the outcome, then going through the process just to say you did is, I hope no one's picking that message up here, because that is not the right move. If you go into a RFP or selection process, have an open mind. Make sure you are providing all suppliers with the equal information, and you're declaring and making your team aware of any conflicts. just communicate and make sure there's a question and answer process in your selection process. Allow for feedback from the suppliers, and then once the process is over, offer feedback to them, especially obviously those who weren't successful. That is the way they'll get better for you and for your nonprofit neighbor the next time that supplier is going through a selection process. And finally, lean on others. Any selection process, we recommend as many, not as many as possible, because you can have selection teams that are too big, but whether it's 2, 4, 6, in some cases even 8 or 10 people involved in a selection process, you want the multiple perspectives from your organization, and you want to make sure that it aids in the defensibility of the decision if you've got others involved. And then finally, you can collaborate with other organizations, either formally or informally. We're running an RFP right now for 3 organizations for some software that are not necessarily affiliated in any official way, but going out together, we believe, to increase their chances to get really strong responses. Some do's and don'ts. Don't assume that one approach will apply in every case. Be very clear on what your needs are and how to apply which tools. Make sure you understand your regulations. Don't be complacent. This is serious, and how you select your suppliers it should be taken seriously. Just use common sense. An RFP isn't required every time you need to get some party supplies for an event, but at the same token, you don't want to issue a $250,000 consulting agreement just through some informal conversation. So, make sure you're applying common sense. Respect the time and effort that suppliers put into a selection process, and make sure you reach out for help. There's the ONNPP, there's other sources of assistance out there. So if you find yourself getting too bogged down, seek some support. I'll just quickly go through total cost. I know we're tight on time. We've talked about some of this on some earlier discussions, so I can't resist putting the iceberg in. Everyone knows I love the iceberg. I keep putting it in because it resonates with people. It's one thing that people refer to is just understanding and making sure you understand that we at the ONNPP understand it's not all about purchase price. There are many elements to cost. You have to pay attention to all of them. Identify what is important to you and your organization, and what will drive cost. So poor service, poor quality, they will ultimately have a cost in the long run. So again, buying those supplies at the dollar store might have great purchase price, but what is the impact to your quality or even risk down the road? So please make sure you're thinking and focusing on total cost. Don't forget the iceberg. Someone mentioned every time I show this, I should make the iceberg a little smaller. We won't get into climate change. Okay, as I say, balance criteria. So back to the study we ran, we asked the sector what was important to them in making supplier decisions. You can see a long list here. The point is, it certainly wasn't low price as the top of the list. It was high. You'll see it sort of I think 6 down. But there were other things, and it's interesting that quality and reliability were tops of the list, and the notion of total cost and customer service availability. So clearly this will be different depending on what you're buying and depending on your own situation. But really the point is, it's this notion of balanced selection criteria that should drive your decisions, which again ties back into that notion of social procurement. And whether buying from a social enterprise makes sense for you, that should be factored into your selection criteria, whatever you're buying. And finally, we talked about capacity building and how to do this. I'll just try to, people struggle with, okay, how do you make this happen? Let me give you some options. I'm not sure, you'll have to decide what's best for you. Obviously, you can try to take this work that we've described here and build it into your current staff. I know that probably it hurts your head to think about that. If everyone's busy, no one's sitting with their feet up on their desk. But if you can somehow work your structure to allow for someone internally to take ownership of this, that'll be what drives some of these changes. You can build the staff or capacity internally. So, whether it's new hire or expand, there may even be a ability with, depending on your funding agency, to get funding for this sort of thing, because again, people care about how you spend your money. Well, if you can get funding for some support to do that, that's wonderful. There are third parties available, whether it's traditional consulting or more of an long-term operating model. There is third-party support out there. We're one example, but of course there are many, and that's what we do at Roundtable. It's a challenge, of course, can be a challenge from a budget side, but if you can drive enough savings, it can easily cover your costs. And then finally there's that notion of taking advantage, leveraging group programs out there. ONNPP is one, there are others, but that can be one of the most cost-effective ways to get some support and get some benefits of good procurement without a lot of effort or cost internally. Just to illustrate that, just some schematic conceptual curves, just to give you an idea. I think what we've seen in the upper left is if you use your current resources, it's the lowest cost. You're using your current cost, current effort. You'll have some improvement over time. It'll be a little more slow, and you'll just have to watch that it doesn't tail off if you don't stay on top of it. So, it's the most cost effective. It might have the least dramatic results. You can add someone full-time, and of course then that gives you a little more sustainability of benefits by having somebody full-time focused on it. It also has higher costs naturally. There's the idea of the external consultants, as I said, can be a little bit more cost up front, especially if you run it as a single project. If you do that, then you'll probably see benefits tail off over time. So, I used to be part of Deloitte Consulting. We used to go into large for-profit organizations back then and help for 6 or 9 months, leave and then come back again, when that benefit had dropped off. So if you go the short-term project work, just be careful that you're not seeing the results tail off over time. And then there's the idea of building your work with a buying group or other collaborative models where it truly is a lower cost. Might be a little more effort at the beginning of your staff as you're figuring out how to integrate whatever solution you're looking at, but because you've got someone probably focused on running the buying group, the benefits tend to stay there over time. You just need to make sure you're working on your own internal team to make sure they continue to take advantage of those benefits. But you lose some control because you're relying on others to help make some buying decisions for you. You gain in that ratio of cost to benefit. Just to wrap up, before I check to see if there's any final questions, just if you have some takeaways, I'd ask that they're these. Just remember that procurement matters, and more than ever in the sector, and doing it in a thoughtful, formal, professional, just something that is top of mind, doing it in a way that is not sort of off the side of everyone's desk is important and will actually impact your whole organization's performance in a positive way. Make sure you're aware of your regulatory and policy requirements. Your funders probably are making sure you're aware, but even the most common or the broadest is the broader public sector. Even if you're under 10 million a year in provincial funding, there's some great resources around the directive that, the guidelines that they provide that are really, really good. And we were part of helping as those were developed, and they've been developed based on best practice. So we've got I think we've got a good white paper out there about how following those BPS guidelines is not a bad thing. It's actually going to help you get closer to best practice. Make sure you put an eye to how you're managing your supplier selection with the lens of the information I passed on today. How do you feel about it? Is it fair? Is it clear? Is it thorough? Are you getting to decisions that you can feel good about, even if they're decisions that are done in a day and a half? They don't have to be 6-week RFP processes, but just the principles around good sourcing. Are you following them internally? Part of that is, keeping total cost in mind. So it's tempting to chase low price. Don't forget that there are many other factors that will contribute to the cost of a good or service. And then if, as I've mentioned many times, and that came for the top poll, collaboration, there are opportunities out there. You know, be aware of the ones that are available to you. And I think that's where I can talk about the ONNPP just quickly. One of them is the ONN purchasing program. It was based on this the research that we did together, and it became clear that the ONN could play a role in helping its participants, its network in just doing this purchasing thing better. And many different ways you can go about it. A lot depends on your own situation. So feel free to give us a call, send us an email, or just check out some of the resources that are available through the ONN site. And we're always open for feedback. So if there's something that you don't see there that you'd like to see, please let us know. And sorry if I rushed those last bit, but I know we're getting tight on time.
That's okay. Thank you so much, David. That was
Thanks.
really informative, and we will be sending out the slide deck. So for those of you who are trying to write down notes or really trying to keep up because there's so much to learn, don't worry. We will be sending that in the next couple of days with the recording of this webinar. Now, we have had a lot of questions. Some of them are very industry specific. So for those ones that are industry specific, I really encourage you to reach out to the RTPS team. Again, the information will be sent to you following, so that way you can get better information and better informed. But quickly, before we finish up the webinar, it'd be great to go over some of the more general questions we had. And so one of them was specifically about changes in our current government. So in light of the recent Government of Ontario announcements regarding purchasing and their desire to bring most purchasing under one umbrella, how do you see that affecting procurement for the nonprofit sector?
I mean, I won't get into specifics, but I think it just highlights that it is something, look, it's hitting those kind of agendas. It's something that is not, you can't avoid it anymore. I mean, we'll look at maybe some more detail in a future discussion, but just, you know, bring it, you know, unless you've got too many other issues to deal with, bring it to your board. You know, boards are great resources for how to manage, and really a lot of this stuff should be worked into your policies as an organization. The thing is, the impact's going to be different for every organization. The biggest message I take away from that is that this is something that is important, and all the more reason why we have to keep thinking about it and keep thinking about how you can get better as an organization.
Great, thank you.
It's not very helpful, but it's a deep issue.
It is a deep and very complex issue.
Yeah.
One that maybe isn't as complex of an issue is someone's wondering, you know, when they are trying to post RFPs, is there somewhere that you recommend that they can post them, or is it very industry specific?
Well, it can be both. Biddingo is a common one we use, and so biddingo.com. So that is what I recommend. Merck's is the other, although Merck's tends to be very popular for government RFPs. So either of those are the largest, I think, in Canada. And then, as I mentioned, depending on the topic or your subsector, there may be some other association boards or more specialized websites that you could post it as well.
Great. So we're going to conclude the webinar with one final question. So someone's asking, can you comment on the opportunity specifically with the ONN purchasing program on being able to save costs and make arrangements with suppliers for discounts?
Sorry, comment on it.
So comment on, you know, are they able to work with suppliers for discounts through the ONN purchasing program? For
sure. So we have some that have been pre-negotiated. I think I mentioned it. I had it quickly listed on the previous slide. But so we have pre-selected suppliers for employee benefits, for cell phones, for print, and for office supplies. So and we will be working on more. So those are preset, and we've selected suppliers for those. For anything else, we can help. We know, I think, all the supplier markets of everything the sector buys by now. So if you're just looking for some advice or for some actual selection help, we can support and whatever you need. But for those four, please check out the ONN website related to the ONNPP, and you'll see the details on those four categories.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming in today, David. And thank you so much for everyone who joined, who shared questions. If your question wasn't answered, please feel free to reach out to the RTPS team. They are here to help and are able to provide a lot of expertise in this area. We hope that you stay connected with ONN, whether it be through social media, through our newsletter, or reaching out to us by email. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.